Just when you thought Sportswire was going to coast into 2022, go into 2023, nah, we ain't going out like that. We got one more segment here when it comes to the world of professional wrestling. And I promise you, there's going to be a lot we're going to get into. We're going to talk about some of our favorite moments of 2022, plus some other things to look ahead here. And there was a lot to talk about here in the world of professional wrestling. And some people say, wrestling, it's not in the boom phase. No, there was so much to get into. And of course, one of my guys, as always, who's been here with us for a very, very long time on Sportswire Radio. He's a part of our LWF Power Hour, but we're not talking LWF today because, well, we talked all about it last week, and we know we'll definitely speak plenty about the LWF in 2023. He is one of the premier guys around. He is one of the premier tag team wrestlers around with, of course, Crossfire. We'll talk a lot about them. I'm sure we'll drop a thought or two in them, plus much, much more. So with wait for it. Further ado here on the Sports Report, number one global sports show, pro wrestling star here from the LWF. His name is Wildfire Nate Reese. My friend, how are you?
Hi, Tom. Good to be back on the Sports Report. Hope you've had a good holiday break with Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever else. The listeners, the viewers will be celebrating. Happy holidays to everybody. I feel like you're going to need to save your voice till 2024 now after that. What a throat-melting introduction. Well, absolutely Vince McMahon-esque, incredible.
Well, the running joke this year on Sportswire has been, whether it's been from fellow wrestlers or anybody else's, and the only thing they remember is the intros. But yeah, as for my voice, listen, I at this point, I mean, we'll see. I may not one day have a voice, but certainly most people have been celebrating the holidays. They've been taking it easy. No, not us on Sportswire. I think I was live 1, 2, 3. This will be my 5th time I'm live this week. So most people, and this is the first day in over 3 weeks, I'm actually no longer sick. It was 20 plus days. I couldn't shake the cough, the cold, the headaches. They're all gone, and it's a beautiful day here in New York, and it's a beautiful day to speak with you, and it's always a beautiful day, in my opinion, to speak about something we love, that is the world of professional wrestling. And, well, Friday Reese, there was so much to get into this year in the world of professional wrestling. I was listening to Bully Ray yesterday on Sirius XM's Busted Open. He was saying, wrestling, and it's not in a boom phase. But then I think about all the moments that we had in the world of professional wrestling, and whether it's locally, whether it's internationally. And I mean, what were some of the more memorable moments for you this year in 2022?
I think it's a difficult statement there. Like you mentioned that people have mentioned that wrestling's not in a boom phase. In some ways it is, but what's tended to overshadow a lot of great wrestling, and I think people have greatly misinterpreted that in 2022, wrestling's been very good in a lot of ways. There's been a lot of great shows, a lot more higher standards of professional wrestling in terms of in-ring action. There's been a lot of stories outside the ropes which have maybe overshadowed a lot of all of the great things that have been occurring. Excuse me. And whilst we may not be currently within a boom phase, I do feel that we are on the cusp of potentially introducing a new boom phase or a new integration of what professional wrestling may be, particularly within the US, sort of moving forward. And obviously within the UK as well. We had Clash at the Castle last year in September.
Yep.
First pay-per-view in the UK in over 30 years, since SummerSlam 1992. We've got the rebranding of NXT UK into NXT Europe. So I feel that there'll be much bigger plans for what iteration that will be for the wrestlers and for all the people involved within NXT UK as it's moved through that transition to NXT Europe. We've got stalwarts like William Regal coming back from AEW to help assist run WWE. WWE has a complete new command and power structure for the first time in potentially 40 years, which is a whole other thing.
I mean, that's a whole keg of worms I'm sure we're going to get into.
So there's been so much to talk about, and seemingly it feels like every month there's been a huge story, even starting from January with the women's tag team champions Sasha Banks and Naomi just choosing to leave, then to everything through that's happened throughout this year. Ring of Honor being reintroduced, Ring of Honor being owned and rebranded by Tony Khan, everything that's happened with AEW bringing in New Japan talent, all the drama at the All Out press con, which I'm sure again is one that we're going to delve far more into detail.
I don't know if I see anything like that. I mean, we'll get into that for sure in a little while. But yeah, that was definitely something that was bizarre to say the least with the All Out press conference there months back.
And then we've got talent jumping forward, then jumping back. And similar to the Monday Night Wars in some respects, particularly with Cody Rhodes now choosing to leave AEW, who was a former executive vice president there, to potentially cementing himself as WWE's next big main event star and potentially the man to dethrone Roman Reigns, who is in the middle of the longest title reign in years, the hottest storyline in WWE, ones that fans are thoroughly invested in throughout a variety of different reasons. And potentially he could be the man that could beat Roman Reigns.
Well, we'll find out. I mean, listen, I'll find out. We'll certainly, like everybody else, I want to get to a bunch of people here who have some comments here towards you. I want to give a big shout out to Wednesday's guest, who I sort of referred to on Sportswire Radio, Mr. C2K, Courage to Kill, of course, who's getting ready to go back in the ring in April 2023 for our friends over at RZW here in upstate New York. Of course, C2K is now doing rap music. He's doing acting. He's doing a whole bunch of different things, and he tunes in, and he's a big fan of yours. He says, Wildfire Nate Reese is the man. So you got fans even from the state of New York, and no, not just me. And of course, the new Messiah, Nicholas Crenson, is in the house, and love Nicholas Crenson. Nicholas is going to be back with us 2 weeks from tomorrow on Sportswire Radio. And of course, he is from our friends over at Wrestling Championship Entertainment. He says hi, and he says, wrestling is always evolving. Yeah, wrestling, nope. I feel like it's always evolving. I mean, how can anybody say, well, it's this, and that? But, I mean, I do want to touch upon the show you talked about for the first time in 30 years, Clash at the Castle. I mean, certainly this was a big deal. I mean, you think about, obviously, it's kind of almost mind-boggling to me that the WWE hadn't returned to the UK for a big show. We're not talking about some of those shows that used to run back kind of in the Attitude Era, those special European-only shows. This was the first, like you said, in 30 years. And talk about some of those things. There was actually a lot that happened at that show as well. I mean, you saw Drew McIntyre and Roman Reigns for the title, and what a battle that was, and just the event. It might have been, I think, in some ways more important than this year's WrestleMania. So talk about that for a few minutes.
That's a really great point that you brought up there, Tom, with that opinion that it, in some ways, overshadowed WrestleMania because of the nature of it, the volume of capacity of people that went to that show. You know, it was a large-scale show. I know a lot of friends, family, peers that went to that show. Of course, Stephen Cross wouldn't save up the money to get me a ticket to go.
I remember asking you, I'm like, are you going? And you were like, nah, I'm not going. And it was kind of a little bit of a bummer.
I would like to, but, you know, tag partners, ride or die, just couldn't quite make it there. But I would love to if the opportunity ever came again. In terms of repercussions, the main event, Drew McIntyre versus Roman Reigns, was as excellent as a main event as you'll find this year. I think people have made threats on it.
And that was Solo Sikoa's debut also, by the way. Solo Sikoa, that was where he debuted.
That's it, onto the main roster, feeding into the Bloodline storyline. You also had Dominic Mysterio turning on Rey Mysterio, which has been a huge portion of Raw. I think from people may have greatly underestimated his role within WWE to something that's actually kind of almost must-see TV every week. What's going to happen with him now? So he's made himself incredibly relevant within a few months, which is all credit to him for having that willing to change. And again, wrestling is always evolving, and he managed to do something so different than what anyone would have expected him to do.
Absolutely, no question about that. And I've got some comments in here, so I'm surprised. People just seem to be commenting more and more on Sportswire shows. C2K wants to remind us that new YouTube show coming out next year's Looking for Paranormal. D for D, Wayne, Vaughn out for blood, jumped and scared. Thank you for the plug. The new Messiah, Nicholas Crenson, makes a good point. He says Gunther versus Sheamus was a match that under Vince would not have looked as good, in my humble opinion. What's your thoughts as a fellow wrestler? One wrestler saying that, and you're also a fellow wrestler. Is that something that you would have agreed with?
You know, yeah, I think Nicholas makes a really great point there. And I think that looking at where Gunther has been able to take his matches, particularly on the WWE main roster, where if you think about the match he had in NXT UK just before he left for the main roster, the ones he was having with Ilya Dragunov, which were just something else, something so different than what you would expect in the WWE umbrella. He's been able to incorporate that now with Sheamus, who seems somewhat rejuvenated, and again, it's a new role for him.
And we
He's
spoke a
had,
lot about him in the last year, and I feel like Sheamus, I know he's had some runs with the world title, and he's had some great moments. He'll definitely be a Hall of Famer, but I really feel like Sheamus's career has been rejuvenated since his feud way back last year with Drew McIntyre. I feel like that since then, his ring work has been on a whole nother level.
that's it. He's found his place. He's comfortable. He's confident. Very similar to like how Randy Orton presents himself now whenever
Right.
he's there.
Well, before the injury with Randy Orton, yep.
Yeah. So he's now got this run. He's with the Brawling Brutes. It's another take for the audience to interpret Sheamus as well, something that they might not have seen before and want to get behind. Having somebody bigger that can hit harder, that makes Sheamus an underdog. It makes Sheamus somebody you want to root for. Gunther's been on a great run. He's had matches with, he had a match with Mysterio on SmackDown. He had a great match with Ricochet, not too long ago as well. He's somebody who I think is going to continue to be more versatile. And I don't know if the powers that be can make it happen, but him versus Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania is a big one on my tick list. Like, that's got to be. That's the one I want to see. Make that happen, please.
Well, I think Brock Lesnar might be actually the one wrestler that decides who he wrestles. So, I mean, certainly I would say everybody else, yeah, you might have a point there. And I also wanted to point out our old friend who I actually covered with KOW, that was Pete Dunne, came to the main roster under a different name. I wanted to give him a shout out, especially for our local UK wrestlers and fans, because famously Butch had got his start in KOW, which was people was like pretty wild, kind of hard to fathom there. But he also debuted as well on the main roster. And I also have to bring it up. I want to get it out of the top here. And I have a few more comments I'll get to. But I mean, obviously, the news that everybody's been talking about WWE, and that's most notably Mandy Rose. I mean, Mandy Rose, who had really rejuvenated. You want to talk about rejuvenating careers? Yeah. I mean, she arguably had the best run of her career. She was the NXT Women's Champion for 413 days. Over 1 year, she held the title. And Toxic Attraction, in a way, I think, kind of rejuvenated the NXT brand a bit. And then she, well, most notably, is no longer in the WWE. She basically goes from at the top to, I mean, she's at the top of, I guess, red-blooded men all over the world, but for different reasons. But I think that is, it is a big story right now in professional wrestling. She is really at the top of people's minds, and as I pointed out, also most red-blooded males.
On the top of a lot of wish lists and search engines, I believe probably might be the way to
yeah, she's probably got a few wish lists out there. She's going into another person that's a huge wrestling fan, and Kendra Lust territory. That's all I'm gonna say.
So I think with this story in itself, I think the first bit is to look at Mandy Rose, NXT champion. She went there as somebody who maybe the audience had a certain assumption about her.
Right.
And that it almost initially, particularly with people from the main roster going down to NXT, almost felt like a downgrade or some sort of negative connotation, but it's actually not necessarily true. It's about making the most of what is presented to you, what opportunity you can get given. The New Day, the current NXT Tag Team Champions, Apollo Crews has been able to have an entirely different run there. They're probably more preferable to.
A much better run. I know he had the U.S. title there for a while, but he dropped the fake accent, and he's kind of where he should have been probably like 5 or 6 years ago in the WWE.
This is it. So for Mandy Rose to actually go back down, and there's certainly been an increase in ring work, overall presentation, being able to completely change herself to the point where she can be put in that position as a women's champion, Toxic Attraction. So then she's been able to help promote, you've got 2 other stars with her as well to create a full unit that is one of NXT's main attractions along with Bron Breakker in whatever iteration it's been over the last 12 to 18 months, which again, it's completely changed and has continuously evolved. So there's a lot of praise that should go out there to Mandy Rose. Now, I suppose the story is here where it divides, because we know we've had issues with wrestlers on like Selena Vega with Twitch before and streaming services. But this is a very different thing. This is I guess, a custom order or subscription service that people would subscribe to for content that doesn't suit WWE's corporate and brand identity.
Probably most places in the world.
I'm being very diplomatic on this. I understand that you've got sponsors of this.
I understand.
And so, I mean, ultimately, I can understand why, because it doesn't suit, if they've got meetings with Mattel about action figures, or they've got meetings about the Be a Star movement, for example. They can't have one of their champions corresponding with online material that, again, would be a quick internet search for the average person to find. Really, that's one thing I know Triple H always concerned about, having China inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. So, no, it's a very slippery slope. It's not the days of let's say Maria, Tori Wilson, Sable, China. You pointed out, it's definitely a different world. I've actually got some comments from some people, so let me try to get these in. I'm surprised. You think, like I said, you think it's holiday week. People are just they're going out and no, they actually. I'm getting more comments than I usually get. And the new Messiah, Nicholas Crenson. Oh, here we go. Vinny Anarchy, who's Tuesday's guest on Sportswire. We're going to give Vinny a big shout out. Tuesday, he's on with us Tuesday, 3 o'clock Eastern Time, 8 o'clock British Standard Time. Says, "What's up, Tom? Hope all is well." We'll go with Vinny's comment first here on for you, Wildfire Nate Reese. What do you think about Gunther?
Cool, great start. So I'd seen some of Gunther's work previously, back when he was Walter for Progress Wrestling. I rate Gunther quite a lot. I think he's gone through quite a transformation in terms of his body, which I know some people didn't like. Some people preferred the old style look of looking more like a traditional wrestler. Some people like that he looks a lot leaner, a bit more sleeker now. Again, it's depending on opinion. The best thing about Gunther is a different style of ring work. So when you watch his matches, there is a reason to watch him. If you think about a lot of other people, and you could compare him to athletes, maybe say like a Keith Lee, for example, where you feel like you might have seen everything that Keith Lee's done, you can kind of match Gunther up with anybody, and it's a really interesting dynamic. Very physical, very different, but there's a very realistic standpoint as well. Like, you believe everything that Gunther's going to do, and you believe everything that happens within those matches. And they may take a different pace. The Rey Mysterio match is actually a very good example of this. It's around sort of, I want to say 15, 16 minutes. And the first 7 to 9 minutes is very Gunther controlled. And it's that slower pace, but and the Ricochet one, when it pays off, there's payoffs all the time. And he's really good at finding the right way of building out just the best in anyone that he works with. And they're always really interesting matches. Very different. Again, some people loved the Clash at the Castle one. Some people found it comparable to matches in Japan. Some people maybe didn't enjoy it as much. They felt it was too strike-orientated. Again, it's different people's perspectives on wrestling. But I think Gunther's somebody that is well worth his money. He's going to make an indelible mark in WWE. If they find the right way to keep his progression moving upwards, he will be a big star for them.
Oh, I think no question. He's got a championship that is one of the more valued championships in the WWE. Certainly, it's a lot more valuable than the 24/7 title, which most famously the WWE got rid of that title. But let me get to some more comments. First, let me get to our very dear friend, of course, your hometown buddy there, who gave us a long comment. That is, of course, our brand new TNT Ignition World Champion. That is the natural born fighter, RP Davis. And he says here, great year for wrestling, both globally and in the UK. It's funny, he said that I had a conversation with an American wrestler just about this off the air in 2022, and I think it'll be even bigger in 2023. Massive thanks to the both of us for all the promotion, and the station here on Sportswire has given me personally, as well as the promotions I represent, most notably Odyssey Pro Wrestling, Future Shock, TNT, the Kingdom of Wrestling. I appreciate it more than you know. All the very best for the new year to you and the listeners. I will catch up in 2023 when I add a couple of more titles to my ledger. Much love. Boy, RPD is already throwing predictions out there, but I will tell you, I will give a prediction that RPD will join somebody like Disciple, who's holding the GT Ministries and the Nonstop Action Wrestling World titles. I have no doubt that RPD is going to be holding a couple of world titles at once. You kind of feel like he's on the cusp of that. So everybody, please follow the Natural Born Fighter, RP Davis, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and follow some of the great companies he is a part of. And yes, he will definitely be coming back to Sportswire. And he was the first UK wrestler I ever interviewed. The first American wrestler I interviewed was a guy, Chad Parham, who had famously, and I always tell this story very quickly, he had wrestled Jeff Hardy on TNA Impact years ago, and he was AJ Styles' tag team partner in the old NWA Wild Side. We're talking we're
Amazing.
going back. Yeah, we're going back, I want to say, to about 2000 or so, just before AJ Styles got hired at the very tail end of WCW. But thank you, RPD, for all you do, and congratulations formally on winning the TNT Ignition Championship. Long overdue. The new Messiah, Nicholas Cranston, says Mandy Rose versus Zoe Stark from Heatwave is one of my favorite matches this year. Absolutely, that was a great match. Excellent point there. Mandy Rose, again, really improved in her ring work. She was somebody that people thought, this whole thing with Otis, and she had the whole thing with Sonya Deville, and she was kind of somebody almost like eye candy, but she really improved in her ring work. Probably a most improved wrestler of the year candidate for sure. Gunther's chops, big or small, are always brutal. Absolutely no question on both those things from the new Messiah, Nicholas Cranston. And speaking of things here in the WWE, I mean, it doesn't matter, but we're going into 2023, and Roman Reigns is still the champion. And on top of that, the Bloodline, the Uso brothers, they are now the longest running SmackDown Tag Team Champions of all time. You kind of refer to the New Day, our NXT champions. Of course, they knocked them off for that run in terms of how many days. And the Bloodline, it doesn't matter, but you kind of referenced it a few times. But I think when you think about wrestling stories of the year, you have to mention the Bloodline.
Oh, absolutely. It's evolved into such a natural progression, and it's the must-see storyline on WWE TV. Everyone's personally invested in it. They found ways, like you mentioned with Solo Sikoa before with Clash at the Castle, to introduce him within a new element and keep the dynamic going. Sami Zayn, he's a long time. I've always enjoyed Sami Zayn's wrestling.
Yep.
To see him be able to progress and grow within a brand new role to where he can become quite the fan favorite within the company, and it's already evolving. And
I think he already is. I think he already is, Wild Friday, Reese. He already is a fan favorite.
So we will see what happens with him, and hopefully that will lead on to much bigger things. I'm possibly going to throw it out there with the way that I feel things are going. I'm just going to say the Usos versus Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens at WrestleMania for the tag belts. That's kind of the way things feel, but we'll see what happens. There's a lot of time in the Royal Rumble ahead of us first.
Listen, and right now, John Cena is going to be Kevin Owens' tag team partner tonight. I had to give that an honorable mention before I get to some more comments, as John Cena is returning to the ring for the first time since SummerSlam 2021 against Roman Reigns, and that will make it now 20 calendar years in a row that John Cena has wrestled a match in the WWE. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's a really, really historic run. You're thinking about, I think Undertaker's done that, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe a handful of other wrestlers. Triple H, I believe, has done the 20 calendar years. Orton would be somebody else that's come to mind consecutively. It's very few wrestlers. I believe Kane has done that.
I feel Kane would have been maybe one of those guys.
I think Kane, because if you would have counted Isaac Yankem, he definitely would have did it. So I think Kane would have definitely been on that list. But there's very few wrestlers I could think of that have done what John Cena has done here, and I was tongue-tied even thinking about it. The new Messiah, Nicholas Cranston, also says, too bad we won't get the student versus teacher match of Mandy Rose versus Lita. Yeah, I mean, we saw Becky versus Lita. I would have liked to have seen a Mandy Rose versus a Nikki Bella, maybe. That would have been more, because they kind of had the mock, well, not the mocking, but she was sort of imitating off her attire. That would have been interesting. Sami Zayn is one of the best things in the WWE and the Bloodline. Absolutely, no question. I think I even posted a video on Instagram out there where I was so pumped up at the most recent show with the whole Sami Zayn and the Bloodline thing. So, yep. Want to give a big shout out, of course, to our very dear friend, Mr. Hybrid, the CCW World Champion. He's the Underground Heavyweight Champion, and he says praying this year's Rumble makes up for last year's. Well, we're going to find out. I mean, Rumble season, we're just about getting into. This is when I always feel like wrestling season gets good. When you get into Rumble season for me, although I've always thought Survivor Series into Mania, but there is a point to be made here. But some other stories here, going over to AEW, and I mean, you kind of, I think, mentioned it very briefly, but I mean, CM Punk, who last year when we spoke was the big story, but for different reasons. But this year, in a lot of ways, he's a big story, maybe for not so much the right reasons.
What a difference a year can make. So CM Punk returns to wrestling after 7-8 years.
I think 7 years.
Fans have derailed shows by chanting his name for years and years and years. Desperate for him to come back. He chooses to go to All Elite. He's made his mark there, signed the contract, appears. Incredible moment. I believe it's the first Rampage? Or the second episode of Rampage?
Yeah. I think it's the highest rated one they had. I believe it was like 1.2 million viewers or something like that, I believe.
This was it. So this was somebody who was genuinely hot, that again hadn't petered out, that come back, ready to wrestle, had, working lots of interesting matches. He had the match with Darby Allin. He's had matches with that Powerhouse Hobbs. He had the incredible feud with MJF. And I think this is the thing that people are starting to get mixed up, was that CM Punk has given this company a lot of worth and a lot of value creatively. It's one of his most interesting runs that he's had. You could tell he was invested in it. He's really tried to put this effort in, and then this all-out incident has happened, and then perspective just completely sideswiped and changed about how people might perceive him. But I don't want people to take away anything from that run, because that was a very, very good run creatively for AEW. Fresh face that was needed, a main event talent. Had a few issues with injuries, but again, it actually added in some ways to some of the matches that he had and made the most out of any difficult situation.
Absolutely, no question about it. I mean, I do think that he added a lot to AEW, but unfortunately, this whole thing with the Elite and everything else, where you kind of let the personalities get in the middle of things. But I do think that CM Punk added a lot to AEW, and I think that he brought something that they lacked, was kind of that casual fan interest, because he was kind of like, in some ways, the modern day Bret Hart, where you were kind of hoping. And what was even better about CM Punk was that he still had something left in the ring. By the time Bret Hart had finally come back to WWE, he was basically, unfortunately, an old man. And we do have here another comment from Nicholas Crenson, the new Messiah. One match I say anyone learning to wrestle to study is how to pace a match is Sami Zayn versus Shinsuke Nakamura, who I believe is going to be wrestling outside of WWE coming up. I believe at the is it the next against the Great Muta, I think. Is it the next? That's at one of the Japan shows. I saw that, and I was blown away by that. From Takeover Dallas is a perfect example of well-paced and structured match and telling a story, which Nicholas Crenson makes an interesting point on, because that was something we were speaking about on one of our shows this past week with Jarrell Diaz. Jarrell Diaz, of course, is a longtime wrestling star, and now he's a manager, promoter out here in Southern California. That was something we were speaking about with Jarrell. And we are here with pro wrestling star Wildfire Natives, who I want to mention for everybody, if you are listening and watching, give him a follow on Instagram at Nate_Reese_wrestling, Nate Reese Wrestling, also on Facebook. Also, the LWF, please follow on Instagram, the LWF Wrestling, LWF Thought on Twitter, LWF Thought also on Facebook, LWF Television on YouTube. The LWF is always doing great things, and we love the LWF on Sportswire Radio. My name is the Reverend Tom Bryce, and if you like what you hear from us on Sportswire Radio, continue to give us a like on Facebook, as we have over 500 plus followers. So thank everybody for that. Also crossed the 100 subscriber mark on YouTube, which I don't even promote. So I'm happy that people want to relive some of our shows. They can kind of do that now on YouTube. And also 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. If you don't like my mugshot, you can always listen to the audios here on sportnarium.com/player. Also want to announce here that this Monday, right before Monday Night Raw. I'm going to do a little special Raw pregame show with the guys from the Pipe Bomb Wrestling Podcast, who you hear on Sportswire Radio. There's, of course, Chris Belcher and the Young Buck, Andy York. We're going to speak because they're going to be actually in Nashville for the first Raw of 2023. So we're going to get a little about 30-minute, 45-minute segment from the guys, and we'll do that live here on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We'll do all of that here. That'll be 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So looking forward to being with the guys. The guys haven't been on in a while, so we'll see if they can hear me when they're in Nashville. But I look forward to getting everybody for the first Raw of 2023. But in the meantime, we're speaking about 2022 here with pro wrestling star Wildfire Nate Reese of the LWF, and I am sure many other places here in 2023. And also, speaking of things here, when it came to AEW, and you kind of touched upon him, I think MJF, to me, is the guy that's going to be so interesting in 2023 because he's the champion, and he's obviously certainly had some big feuds here in AEW. John Moxley we just saw, and you mentioned CM Punk, also Chris Jericho. I kind of think was the feud that kind of crystallized him a little bit. We've seen him with Wardlow a little bit, who now got his hair cut. Spoiler for those who watched AEW Dynamite last week. But to me, I think MJF is a story. But I also think he's a story if you're looking to go into 2023. Give me your thoughts on MJF, our AEW World Champion.
He's the right man for the job. More than anything else, to beat the AEW World Champion currently with the title situation, with the fallout from All Out, sorry to rhyme, but with everything that happened there, he's the right person. Moxley, because of sort of the back and forth with CM Punk, to have a fresh champion, I think it was the right thing.
Yep.
It's more than the right time for MJF because they've sort of teetered and weren't too sure what they wanted to do, or then they sort of get a little bit of cold feet. He's absolutely the right man for it. What an absolute representative. Everywhere that he's on. He could be on talk shows. He could be at the airport. He could be on a radio show speaking to you, Tom.
No. He doesn't want to speak to me, but I do know that actually there was there's a New York sports talk host that actually he kind of called out MJF in a way, and MJF's going to go on there probably bury this guy. And this guy does kind of deserve to get buried. His name is Craig Carton. He went to jail. He's a controversial figure in kind of sports talk radio, and I'm sure MJF is going to wipe the floor with this guy. And MJF famously with Busted Open's Dave LaGreca, he and him have gone back and forth. So, no, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole with MJF. I actually have the reason I'm not going to touch MJF is because I actually have a kind of, I should probably say this on there. People are going to think I'm so impressed. They're going to be so impressed by me, but I actually have friends that played high school football with MJF. In fact, one of my friends, the brute force Brad Weiss, who's on our Friday show, knows Maxwell Jacob Friedman from Plainview JFK, and also Brendan Fitzpatrick, who's a college basketball coach, who's a friend of mine. He also grew up with MJF. So, no, MJF, we're kind of fans of his on Sportswire, so we're not going to go down that road.
No, that's really cool. And as we move throughout 2023, having a fresh face as a champion away from all the other situations that the show can focus and build itself around. I know they've had to do sort of the circumstance with the Blackpool Combat Club. They've had the stuff with Stokely Hathaway. So to have a fresh reset. I know that AEW's had a bit of a rebranding in terms of its imagery and graphic design, leading for the new shows on the networks. Have MJF as your centre figure, build around him. That's the best place to start for 2023. And I think that centre piece there, that's the best way to go.
Absolutely, and I definitely think that he's ready to be the champion. And Nicholas Crenson says, prediction, MJF keeps the belt till the very end of 2023 and loses it to Darby Allin, who seems like he's going to be starting a war with Samoa Joe, of course, who's the Ring of Honor television champion and the TNT champion. So that'll be an interesting feud. So I think that'll be something that we'll be talking about a lot in 2023. And speaking of returns, I got to bring up Sarai. Obviously, let's go with somebody local, obviously here in the UK, in the Knight family. And I had on Dalton Garrett, who obviously knows the Knight family. He's wrestled some of them. We've seen Knight family members. We've seen the when she was Paige, the Paige movie. And I really think in a lot of ways, this is a big deal. The fact that Saraya was returning to the ring to actually wrestle against Dr. Britt Baker. And this was somebody that I don't think anybody thought was going to wrestle again because she had the same injury twice. And I think that's a big story in 2022, seeing Saraya return to the ring.
It is. I mean, anytime anybody gets to have these returns to the ring, and it's very easy to take for granted because we've been very fortunate with wrestling. Whilst wrestling has often made us very unfortunate due to other circumstances, such as the late Scott Hall passing away.
Yeah.
With wrestling, we've had Edge be able to return. We've had Christian be able to return. We've had people like Lita being able to come back from neck injuries. We've had all sorts of people that thought they were retired. Daniel Bryan, Bryan Danielson.
Samoa Joe was a broadcaster, remember, through the pandemic, and he's in the ring. That's an honorable mention.
Absolutely. This is it. So sometimes we can take that very much for granted, but there is nothing given in wrestling particularly. So to have two injuries like that, to then be able to be given the opportunity to wrestle, that's a big deal. So for Saraya, formerly known as Paige, I know that obviously I think a lot of her history outside of the ring has been charted for the last couple of years. So I'm hoping that AEW can be a fresh start for her, so she can just focus on having that wrestling, having the opportunity to do it on her own terms, which, again, I know AEW, it can provide that for the people on its roster. Or as long as, again, I think Tony Khan's focused on enough drama as it is, as long as they can maintain that, keep it focused and streamlined on making sure that Saraya is healthy, can wrestle, that the matches go as well as planned, and that there's a good plan moving forward with her. Perfect. Let's see what can happen. Let's see how she can adjust the women's division, whether it's continually part of All Elite, whether she makes some form of contribution to Ring of Honor's women's division, because that's a given. Essentially, I know Athena's been the new champion there, so that could be something there. There's that trade a lot with those shows as well, those rosters.
Absolutely no question about it. And the new Messiah, Nicholas Crenson, wants to remind us, which is an excellent point. Shibata almost died, and he just recently wrestled Orange Cassidy. Excellent points there. And speaking of wrestlers, I guess it's not really a big story, but I probably should spend at least a minute or two on it. Chris Jericho, I don't know how he's wrestling to the level that he's wrestling. I mean, I know why in some ways, because Jarrell Diaz sort of explained it to us on Tuesday's show on Sportswire Radio, and this was a guy that had talked about his days, growing up with the Seth Rollins, seeing him start out in the ring, and Sean Waltman, yada, yada, yada. But, and I'll get to the wrestler deaths in a second because Nicholas Crenson has a few he wanted to bring up, so I'll get that in a second. But, Chris Jericho was the Ring of Honor champion, I believe, for over 3 months. He's wrestling a who's who of people. He's 50-plus years old, and he's just as relevant as he was in 1999, 2000, and 2002. In some ways, I think he and honorable mention Sting are kind of stories because these guys are well over 50 years old, and they're, still relevant. I think that's kind of a big story in some sense.
I think it's a great learning tool for anybody that wants to become a wrestler, and anybody that's within the wrestling industry and the wrestling business, of how to evolve and how to change. Chris Jericho in particular has kind of been the master of reinvention, and just when it feels like you sort of feel like you know where he's about to run the course, he's very quick to change, or he knows how to change himself. But one of the other things that's very clever, and it's an observation just that I feel like I've made, is within his ring style. And I want you to think about a lot of the moves within his arsenal, Tom. The Walls of Jericho, the Lion's Tamer, the Pyramid Dropkick, the Bulldog, the Codebreaker. Not a lot of those moves require physical exertion in the sense of having to lift an opponent. A lot of that is him placing himself at the right opportunities. So by being able to keep himself fit and healthy, I know he does DDP yoga. I know he's lost a lot of weight within sort of the past 12 months.
Oh, absolutely. He went from, if you remember, do you remember maybe kind of like right before the pandemic, there was kind of like a lot of jokes when you'd see Chris Jericho on Dynamite, and you'd say, well, he's got kind of that like punchy gut, almost kind of like that little, like, I don't know if it was a beer belly, but he had a little bit of a gut. Now you look at him and he's like phenomenal shape. And what he's doing out there in the ring and what he's also doing to me is so impressive because he's doing the thing with Fozzy, and he's finding time to be able to make that balance. And I think Sting's also a little bit of an honorable mention because he's in his 60s and still doing some things. I do want to give a shout out to somebody that's tuned in before I come back to Nicholas Crenton, is Mother Sue from KOW, and she wants to wish us a happy new year. And of course, love Mother Sue. And of course, her son is somebody you know actually from Odyssey Pro Wrestling, that is the unhinged Will Carter. And Will Carter is obviously somebody you know very well in Odyssey Pro Wrestling. And of course, he and Nightmare and are a tag team there, the Freak Show, and they were the champions in KOW. And they just recently, unfortunately, lost the titles to somebody you know very well. That is the unforgettable Andre Decker, a man that you've been in the ring. So I feel like everything ties to Andre Decker. It was funny. I was speaking with a professional wrestler today who I'm sure you know of, Gina. And one of the first things, because I got introduced to him, and I knew him from GT Ministries because he wrestled Bentley, who was in the LW. I forget, everything is like, this is your life. And I said to him, oh, I know that you know Andre Decker. I said, Andre Decker and I have an interesting history together. And he's like, yeah. He's like, yeah, I know you've spoken to Andre Decker quite a bit. So that was kind of like, then it was like the forbidden door, as you might say, kind of opened up there. So Gina is somebody that's coming on to Sportswire very soon. In fact, 2 weeks from today, coming up at 7 o'clock British Standard Time. So I look forward to that. So thank you, Mother Sue, for all of your support. I look forward to more KOW coverage coming up in 2023. The new Messiah, Nicholas Crenton, says, Chris Jericho is the David Bowie of pro wrestling. That's a good one. I hadn't thought of that in that way. He also wants to bring up, which is a good segue, unfortunately, Don West, who, of course, Don West was always kind of like, I guess he was kind of maligned in some ways, but I always enjoyed his enthusiasm with Mike Tenay on those TNA shows. But, I mean, unfortunately, I hate to do it, but we should do it. Talk about some of the wrestling debts that kind of hit us here in the professional wrestling one. You touched upon another one that was really an emotional one. That was right before WrestleMania. That was Razor Ramon, a.k.a. Scott Hall. But talk about maybe some wrestling debts that kind of hit you a little bit.
I suppose Scott Hall's probably the most prominent. I know we talked about it when it happened.
Yep.
The first encounter I had with pro wrestling, or the one that I feel that I can remember when I was a young man, was my aunt would buy me the VHS cassettes.
I remember those. I remember those.
So US Rampage 1992, the opening match was Razor Ramon versus The Undertaker. That was the first match I can really remember, first exposure to professional wrestling. And obviously to see somebody like The Undertaker and then to see Razor Ramon, who, when you think about the finishing moves of that era, to see hold somebody up in a crucifix style position just looked otherworldly at the time. From a 5-year-old standpoint, it looked so different. So I was already sort of enamored to Scott Hall, Razor Ramon at the time then. So that was a significant one. Don West he's somebody that when I first learned to train to become a wrestler, I was watching a lot of TNA at the time. In particular, 2004 to 2007 period was very hot for TNA, very interesting.
They were a good run. They had a great run, TNA. I think right before Hogan came in, they had like some really like good talent, and they really are still a part of professional wrestling today. I mean, TNA had a great. I used to get laughed at. People would say, "Oh, you're watching TNA." My brothers used to laugh at me because of how much I really thought TNA had some phenomenal wrestling in that era you just said.
It was superb, and it was a very different alternative to sort of maybe the heavyweight wrestling being presented by WWE at the time, because it was John Cena, Batista.
The X Division, that's what you're referring to. The X Division was a really revolutionary thing from TNA.
Absolutely. And again, think about half the names that we've already spoken about today. People like, CM Punk, Sting, AJ Styles, Christian.
Samoa Joe.
I
think Kurt Angle had some of his most underappreciated matches in TNA. He had a longer run in TNA than he had in the WWE.
Absolutely. And so many people that have then moved on in some form or another. Roderick Strong moved on from, he was in TNA. Homicide, Low-Key.
Drew McIntyre I rejuvenated his career in TNA. Bobby Lashley had a big run. It was later on. I think the Dudleys actually had a longer run in TNA than WWE as well. Nobody talks about that.
Matt Hardy. Think about how Matt Hardy completely reinvented himself.
Absolutely. No question about it.
So, there's a lot of memorable moments. And to be fair with Don West, he may not have typically had a wrestling background or wrestling knowledge. I believe he was a salesman initially.
Yeah, I think
But
he was a QVC host. He would do
shopping
when
channel
you.
type, yeah.
Yeah.
But his enthusiasm was really infectious and actually translated really greatly onto the program, that you couldn't help but really feel invested by what he was talking about. When you watch wrestling, with the commentators, if they've been told that they have to say something, or if they're not really sure what's going on or too invested. Jim Ross in particular now will make that very clear if you know how to listen for the signals. But Don West in particular really enjoyed being a part of it, really cared about the Impact brand. And every time he was on, you could never not say that he didn't care about it.
Yeah, I always liked Impact. I always thought that Impact had some really, really great wrestlers. And also, of course, because it's been referenced a couple of times on Sportswire, well, the Canadian Destroyer comes from TNA and stuff. Well, I know Scott D'Amore, but I mean, Petey Williams, that's everybody talks about that. So I think that's also kind of an honorable mention. I mean, you think about Chris Sabin, you think about just all the Motor City Machine Guns. I mean, you think about all those great tag teams they had in TNA. I mean, there was the main event Mafia. I mean, I could go all day. I loved TNA. I always loved TNA. People used to kind of lampoon me. Why are you watching TNA? It's a WCW knockoff. No, it really wasn't. I mean, it really actually
No, it
had
wasn't.
it. No, it really had some great moments, and I think that I'm glad that you recognize that. Also, the new Messiah, Nicholas Cranston, wants to say another here in the Midwest was Damon Knight. Damon Knight was the man I won my only big championship from back in 2006, which was almost 17 years ago now. And we spoke about this on Sportswire, so I'll always cherish the memory of his loss. And we will definitely, I'm sure, speak about that with Nicholas Crenson coming up here in 2 weeks from now. And speaking of things you touched upon at the top of the show, which I do think is the probably like number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories of wrestling 2022, which I'm about to refer to is Vince McMahon not in charge of the WWE. I mean, we all thought that Vince McMahon was going to be dead and still controlling WWE somehow, but it's almost like I don't know if it's a dream, a nightmare, whatever you want to call it, but I think that is like, I don't even think just in wrestling. I think it's one of the bigger stories really in maybe like general sports, anything, pop culture, that Vince McMahon is no longer in charge of WWE. I think we have to spend a few minutes on that.
Absolutely. And it's one of those names, isn't it? You think of people like Stan Lee, P.T. Barnum, Montgomery Burns, Walt Disney. You think Vince McMahon is going to stick around forever and be involved in the operation of WWE in some form. But it is. And ultimately, throughout our entire lifetimes, he's been in charge of that company.
Yep, absolutely.
The presentation of professional wrestling that most people, as you mentioned about pop culture and the pop culture lexicon, from Hulkamania, the ice cream bars, Hulk Hogan's Rock and Roll Wrestling, Suburban Commando, the cameoing Gremlins, the Ultimate Warrior.
How about The Rock's movie career? That also, Vince McMahon was an executive producer, I believe, on The Mummy Returns. I mean, that people forget about that.
This is it. SummerSlam 92, all the way through, all the variety of different things. The XFL for its many faults, for its many highs and lows. WWF New York, WWF Studios, the films that they've tried to make.
Yep.
The continual presentation of bringing the wrestlers into superstars, larger-than-life characters.
Remember Ico Pro? Remember the old Ico Pro banners? I mean, have to throw that out there. The old Ico Pro, the Ico Pro.
This is it. So he's been so heavily invested in what we all interpret as professional wrestling. Even as somebody that grew up in the UK with a strong heritage and culture of wrestling, that became greatly overshadowed from probably 1987, 1988, from World of Sport and Big Daddy Giant Haystacks to the WWF, Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, Macho Man, Dusty Rhodes. It very much changed the perception of what people think of wrestling is. And if you think of wrestling now, or if you ask somebody, probably if they say, can you describe what a wrestler is like? They will either say or describe somebody that looks like Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, Randy Savage, or The Rock.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's created that general perception. If there is ever a parody, or if there is ever a wrestler being presented in some form of popular culture, it is a combination of those in some form or another. Then you have in combination WrestleMania, how that's grown to it's almost like a festival. You think of like the music festivals like Creamfields or Leeds and Reading Festival.
Download.
Download, beautiful, yeah. WrestleMania is like that, where 60,000 plus people go to an event for the week.
Oh, it's an event now. Do you remember? Listen, when we were kids, WrestleMania, it would be 1 or 2 days. You'd get the little WrestleMania access. That's it. Now, I mean, I remember when we had WrestleMania 35, and I posted this on Instagram a couple weeks ago. I mean, WrestleMania was basically like a whole week-long thing. It's become like, in a way, it's like the World Cup almost. The World Cup just passed away. I think it's kind of like almost on that level in some ways.
This is it. It's literally generates and stimulates growth for an entire economy for the week, the month on end. Even at Clash at the Castle for that one weekend, the pop-up like merchandise stalls and shops that they had.
I was watching everybody that we probably all know, and I was watching them at these places, and I thought about when I was at the WrestleMania Access in 2019. I mean, I was like, it's a big thing. I mean, people don't realize when you're a wrestling fan, it's like you all talk the same language, and people come from all over, and especially at Clash at the Castle, you're coming from, whether it's England or other parts of Europe or Scotland, Ireland, wherever it is, it's like a really big deal. And especially, I think, because we hadn't had a big show like this in 30 years. So I think, I think like it's a big story here. And another story I had to mention, and I wasn't going to mention it, but I would be a total idiot if I didn't. I have to mention it in some way. I don't know if it's the most memorable moment, but Ric Flair did return to the ring. I mean, I don't know how to really analyze it. I mean, we spoke about it with you. I think I spoke about it with a couple of other different wrestlers that came on. But I mean, Ric Flair, I guess it's his last match. I mean, with Ric Flair, who the hell knows? But it was a big deal that he showed up at StarCast and he wrestled there, and he wrestled alongside his son-in-law against another guy that's a chameleon, and Jeff Jarrett, a guy who's worked for the WWE and the AEW in basically the same role and same capacity this year. And what was so interesting, I believe that weekend, Jeff Jarrett was a referee in the Usos tag team title match, and then he wrestled Ric Flair. I mean, wow. Ric Flair have to spend a couple of minutes on Ric Flair's return. I mean, it was a story to some extent.
It was, and I suppose if you're not following the other stories apart from WWE, AEW, it may have fallen a little bit somewhat under the radar.
They sold a lot of tickets though. That they sold out the show, and they said they had a very good buy rate. I mean, so people did tune in.
And I believe that it's been packaged and the DVD's available, I think, on like High Spots or one of those websites where you can purchase it, or a lot of those other video distributors. So it is something there. As always with Ric Flair, let's just say we'll see. Because I don't think it's his last match, I gotta be honest.
Me either. I don't listen. Ric Flair, I mean, he's going to be one of those guys, if he's 90 years old. He even said it himself. I know he said this in an interview once. He said he wants to die in the ring. I know that he said once in an interview that he wants to die in the ring. Ric Flair is one of these guys. It reminds me a little bit of Evander Holyfield in boxing. He was just going and going and going. It was almost like, well, we can't sanction you. We can't have you anymore. Ric Flair is going to be that part. He might be in backyard wrestling. Nicholas Crenson, he might go to Wrestling Championship Entertainment and wrestle you, because I am sure if he's not sanctioned by some state's commission, he will find his way in a ring. Just something tells me that is a story. And I wanted to mention one more other comeback story before I get to a few other thoughts from you in closing thoughts. I do have to mention it because I do hear his name potentially for a comeback. And it was actually surprisingly a better comeback than I thought it would have been. And that's Stone Cold Steve Austin. I do have to at least give that a mention, because I wasn't going to when we were prepping for this before we went on the air. But I do have to say that Stone Cold, he had the right opponent, but he still looked very good out there in the ring for what it's worth. His body and everything else. And I think that's a story.
Again, we talked about wrestling evolving. We've talked about the opportunities that come up from neck injuries, especially as we mentioned Saraya. Yep. Who'd have thought that Stone Cold would have returned for a match Nobody could have thought
No
within the
way.
time scale since he left in 2003. So again, nearly 20 years ago. But he came back, had a match with Kevin Owens. Again, it was the right opportunity, the right time, the right presentation, because it wasn't just a clear-cut technical wrestling match. It was the presentation of being able to come out first, have the confrontation, Steve Austin running wild like he does, a couple of beers, the quad bike, the ATV. Everybody was ready for it. Everybody wanted that, and it didn't outstay its welcome. So I know that they've been talking about potentially another match. Who he would go against, that's a tough one, because again, you have to find the right thing to make it work.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it has to be an attraction type of thing. I don't want to
Yeah.
see him wrestle. Somebody said on the radio yesterday, Roman Reigns. I don't want to see him wrestle Roman Reigns. I don't want to see that. I think it has to be in the vein of what I saw with Kevin Owens. I don't know who that opponent is. I have to think about it, whether it's somebody like throwing it out there if it helps them maybe get a rub like a Matt Riddle, a Sami Zayn type of character, maybe Seth Rollins, somebody like that. I don't know if those are the right opponents, but I mean, to me, it shouldn't be for the championship. It shouldn't be anything like that. It has to be, I think, somebody that it makes the other wrestler, I think, at least go forward a little bit. And I think that's the way I would go about it. But I don't know. I mean, I think Stone Cold returning to the ring, if it's like the way they did, I think they did it perfectly, where they only had him, except they had the one appearance, and I think they did it just right. And then I guess, is there any other stories you think that's important when it came to the world of professional wrestling in 2022?
It's constantly endless to list, isn't it? So many
Oh,
things
listen,
happen.
I have things. Listen, Triple H, obviously, I think Triple H and his wife, you could mention that. I think for me, one of the companies I've kind of gotten back into a little bit is Impact Wrestling. I think Mickey James right now is in a storyline where basically if she loses, her career is over, and she's wrestling now Jordan Lynn Grace for the Impact title coming up at Hard to Kill. I mean, Impact Wrestling, I know, gets kind of lost in the shuffle a little bit. I think that's kind of their company's doing very well a little bit. I think also Nick Aldis in the NWA no
Just get to
longer. I think that's a big story because obviously Nick Aldis we know here in the UK, and I always thought he was the face of the NWA. He looked like such an NWA wrestler, and I also think Ricky Morton came back to the ring as well in the NWA. I think at the Starcast show, kind of an honorable mention. Ricky Steamboat returned a few weeks. I know it's kind of these are like kind of under the radar because it's not WWE, it's not AEW, but Ricky Steamboat returned to the ring here a few weeks back. FTR I think has been a big story when it comes to tag
yes.
teams. I mean, I'm trying to think of anything else that I think of that would be an important story. I think Matt Cardona has been a big deal in 2022. I mean, here's a guy that again has kind of rejuvenated his career. Saw him at Impact, but you see him in all these different companies in kind of the independent territories, and he's really done very well for himself. I think that's a big story. I think that look, there's countless stories. I think Finn Balor and Rhea Ripley, with that group that they have, I think you mentioned Dominic, which is kind of the same thing. I think that's been a big story. I think John Moxley's wife coming back to wrestling in her role in AEW, I think has helped the talent there. Look, there's countless stories. I mean, we could be here probably for another week just thinking about going over all the big wrestling stories. You mentioned Cody Rhodes as well, which I think will probably be not so much. It is a big story in 22, but I think he'll be a
But
bigger story.
2023,
And I,
absolutely.
and I think the bigger story in 2023, because you can't avoid it, is will The Rock return to wrestling? Which I hate to speculate on this stuff. I really hate because you're a professional wrestler. I interview countless wrestlers, and I really hate to kind of do all that like internet stuff. But I mean, that's basically probably the $1 billion question, or the $1 billion question at this point is will The Rock come back to wrestling? I don't know. I mean, listen, there's so many stories that you can talk about. You can let us know what you think, and these were some of the stories on Sportswire Radio that we spoke about here with Wildfire Nate Reese. So, Wildfire Nate Reese, is going to be a long year since we speak next. So, I want to give you the floor. I want to give you any thoughts, any New Year's resolutions, anything else you want to throw out there, any other social media that I missed. And I now give you the floor. And anything else that's on your mind, fire away.
Thanks, Tom. So, first off, big thanks to everybody that's giving messages today. Obviously, my old pal RPD, he's doing amazing. He's had a really great year. Big thank you to Nicholas, who's created a lot of great questions and points for today.
Nicholas Krentz, he's one of my favorites. He's one of my favorites, Nicholas Krentz. And I want to tell you that on and off the air, he's one of my favorites.
Hybrid, again, everybody that's been contributing, it really helps with these discussions, make these shows add an extra interesting development to it. Lord knows Stephen Cross wouldn't, because I'd have to show him how to use one of those things that isn't like a Nokia 3210 from 2002. So he needs one of those smartphones. He just can't do them. So that's okay. But if anybody wants to follow me, by all means, please feel free to do so on Instagram, Nate_Reese_wrestling. Wildfire Nate Reese on Facebook. Please keep checking the LWF. I believe they are starting to release short promo clips on their reels on Instagram, highlighting the many highs and lows of this year. Of course, the first clip they show of my good self is being slammed to the mat by Franco Varga. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But I digress. 2023, Crossfire, Tag Team Gold, Crossfire everywhere else in British wrestling. Also being able to make more of a mark in Odyssey Pro Wrestling, possibly returning home somewhere else as well, which we'll see what happens if the stars align. Making sure I get to promote and be a part of wrestling as much as possible 2023, alongside celebrating all the great things that happen each and every week, right here with yourself, Tom, on the Sports Report.
Absolutely, and I want everybody one more time to follow Wildfire Nate Reese at Nate_Reese_wrestling on Instagram, Nate Reese Wrestling on Facebook, the LWF, please follow as well, the LWF Wrestling on Instagram, also the Academy. In fact, I'll share this story. I had one wrestler on this week, I won't name names, but he told me one of his goals actually off the air was to come to the LWF Academy. So like I said, I won't say who this wrestler was. He was a UK wrestler. If you can go back, and I'm sure people can tie who I'm talking about, but he told me, I asked him off the air, I said, well, what do you want to do in 23? We spoke and, off the air, we're off. He said, come to the LWF Academy. He said, the LWF has done a great job with the Academy. So that is something that I think everybody needs to support. Also, LWF television as well on YouTube, Facebook, continue to support the LWF and all the great things the company does. We have another show coming up here, January the 28th, Rumble weekend. We'll talk about that Super Hesketh show. I'm sure Wildfire Nate Reese and the Asset Stephen Cross will be a part of that card. So obviously I want to thank everybody here for tuning in. I'll give my final thank yous tonight when I'm on the show for our American listeners on Sportswire. I'll thank all the companies and such then at that point. But I do want to thank, obviously, yourself. I also want to thank, I know you're not going to like me thanking him, but I am going to thank the Scenario Nathan Gunn, because he's been kind of our third man, sort of our unofficial third man for our LWF Power Hour, and he liked my post on Facebook. He actually liked my last couple of posts on Facebook. So Nathan Gunn, is going to be back here before each and every LWF show. Have to give him a shout out. Stephen Cross, your tag team partner, although we haven't heard from him for months on Sportswire, but we do give him a shout out. He speaks with me periodically, just like you, probably a lot more from you, because he's your best friend. So I want to give him a huge shout out. And of course, everybody from the talent that has come on, whether it's the Mysterious Mr. B, the Masked Marauder, obviously Reynaldo, and I'm wearing my Reynaldo shirt here. So I am wearing my Reynaldo shirt. I had to wear at least, I don't have any other LWF shirts. So, that's all I got. So, I have my LWF gear on my paraphernalia from Reynaldo. I want to thank the Wrecking Crew who have come on here in the past. I want to thank Helena Razor. Obviously, certainly, I know you were kind of in the family with Helena, so I want to give Helena a big shout out. Eitan Steen, who is on here on Sports by Radio. Balachius, who I think is the guy to watch in 23. I want to give him a shout out as well. And Balachius, I was one of my favorites on Sportswire. And it's a long list of people that we could thank, but I'll do that later on when I'm on the air. But my friend, Happy New Year. Be well. I hope that New Year's treats you well. It'll be a long year, so think about what we're going to talk about. It's going to be a long year from now that we speak until next week. But I do thank you. Happy New Year. Be safe. Be well out there. And can't wait to speak with you soon.
Thanks very much, Tom. Happy New Year to yourself. Happy New Year to all the listeners and all the viewers and everyone that's followed us right here on Sports Report. And I will be back next week.
All right, look forward to it here. And if you're on Sportswire Radio, we'll go back to our regularly scheduled programming here shortly. And I'll be back here tonight, tomorrow morning, UK time, to speak all things related in the world of sports, plus a few more announcements. So my name is the Reverend Tom Bryce. I'm the man behind Sportswire Radio. Until then, Happy New Year to everyone listening. We will be back once again on the number one global radio station, Sportswire Radio. And thank you to Wildfire Nate Reese as well. And we'll be back here soon.